Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bhakti Fundamentals. Today, we're looking at the topic of moving from the knowledge stage in spiritual life to the realization stage. In other words, bringing spiritual understanding into actual practice, bringing it to life. And to illustrate this point, let's begin with a simple analogy. Imagine you have a brand new bike. You read the manual cover to cover and learn everything about it, every gear, every feature, every function, but you never actually ride it. Without riding the bike, will you ever truly experience what the bike is meant for? What its full potential is? No. In the same way, we may know spiritual truths like I am not my material body, I am the soul within my body, and there is a Supreme Lord, and his name is Krishna. However, if we never live according to that spiritual knowledge, if it doesn't shape our consciousness, our actions, and our daily life, then have we really benefited from it in our day-to-day life? No. And therefore, we come to the important point that spiritual knowledge is not meant to remain theoretical. It is meant to be lived, to be actualized or realized in our life. In the Bhagavad-gītā, Krishna never instructs Arjuna to withdraw from action or sit passively on the sidelines. Rather, he instructs Arjuna to act, but to act in Krishna consciousness, to act for the Supreme, thereby spiritualizing or purifying Arjuna's actions. In other words, Krishna encourages Arjuna to shift from the platform of spiritual knowledge to realization of that spiritual knowledge. In other words, he wants Arjuna to act on the spiritual knowledge that has been given to him. In the Gita, chapter 3, verse 30, after delivering important spiritual truths to Arjuna on the nature of the soul, and karma, activity, etc., Krishna says, "Therefore, O Arjuna, surrendering or dedicating all your works unto me, with full knowledge of me, without desires for profit, with no claims to proprietorship, and free from lethargy, fight." And of course, Krishna is referring to Arjuna fighting in the battle of Kurukshetra, in order to restore justice and peace. In the Gita, we find that Krishna mercifully explains both Jñāna, spiritual knowledge, and Vijñāna, realized knowledge, or knowledge in practice for our benefit. Jñāna refers to understanding spiritual truths in theory, while Vijñāna means that same knowledge lived, applied, and experienced. Spiritual knowledge is meant to be applied, otherwise it cannot save us. Imagine a lone hiker who becomes lost, freezing and starving in the wilderness. Tragically, he leaves his body of exposure. But afterwards, we learn that in his backpack, he had everything he needed: extra clothes, matches to make a fire, granola bars, a compass. The problem was not a lack of resources, but a failure to actually use them. In the same way, Krishna has given us everything that we need to succeed spiritually via his teachings in the Gita. Clear knowledge about the soul, what we are, about himself, about karma and this material world, as well as the practical spiritual process by which we can rise above the suffering of this world. But if we choose to not apply his teachings, then we remain spiritually lost, despite having the solution with us all along. Vijñāna, or realization of spiritual truths, begins when we actually apply what we have been given. We may theoretically know that honey is sweet, but until we actually open the jar and taste it, our knowledge of honey remains incomplete. We will never actually experience its sweetness. Srila Prabhupada often used this example to illustrate that Krishna consciousness is practical and experiential. There is also a danger in remaining only on the platform of spiritual knowledge, the platform of theoretical understanding or Jñāna. and that is that we may become satisfied with simply knowing. We may end up thinking, well, I already know all of these spiritual facts, while our material habits and material consciousness remain unchanged. In a conversation with a yoga student, Srila Prabhupada warned against staying theoretically on the armchair of devotional service. And he continued, "Armchair theory will not help you. You must be practical and there must be enthusiasm. Then it will be successful. You are sitting in the same position and you are thinking that you are making progress. That will fail." Thus, spiritual life is not meant for armchair speculation. It is meant for purification and change. If our day-to-day life looks the same, even after hearing so much spiritual philosophy, then it means our spiritual knowledge has not yet matured into realization of that knowledge. In the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 10, Chapter 14, Verse 4, it is described that those who give up spiritual practice in favor of the pursuit of knowledge alone do not achieve their desired spiritual result in the end. Why? Because they are not acting on their spiritual knowledge. The verse from the Bhagavatam, which is a prayer, reads as follows: "My dear Lord, devotional service unto you is the best path for self-realization. If someone gives up that path and engages in the cultivation of speculative knowledge, he will simply undergo a troublesome process and will not achieve his desired result. As a person who beats an empty husk of wheat cannot get grain, one who simply speculates cannot achieve self-realization. His only gain is trouble." And in the purport, or explanation to this verse, we hear, loving service to the Supreme Person is the natural and eternal function of every living entity. If a person renounces his own constitutional function and instead laboriously seeks so-called enlightenment through impersonal, speculative knowledge, his result is simply the trouble and bother that come from following an artificial process. This brings us to an essential point. Bhakti Yoga is our Sanatana Dharma, our eternal function, our natural spiritual position of rendering loving devotional service to the Supreme. The Supreme Lord, Krishna, is our source, and Bhakti Yoga reconnects us with that source. Just as a part finds fulfillment when connected to the whole, we only find lasting happiness when we actively engage in loving service to Krishna. Real spiritual advancement, therefore, does not come from how much we know materially or spiritually, but from how much we apply in service to Krishna. And ultimately, remaining on the level of spiritual theory perpetuates our stay in the material world, in the cycle of samsara, the cycle of birth and death in the material world. It's only when we practice what we know spiritually that we can exit the cycle of samsara. So what does it mean to move to the platform of spiritual realization? How do we actually bring our spiritual knowledge to life? It means quite simply to ride the bike, to open the jar of honey, to open the hiker's backpack when we need the tools within it, to move from spiritual theory into practice by actively engaging in Bhakti Yoga. These practices are known as sādhana, regulated spiritual practices. Through our bhakti sadhana, what we know begins to shape how we live. Knowledge becomes action, and action becomes spiritual realization. And these practices include chanting the holy names of Krishna in the form of the mahā-mantra, hearing about Krishna in sacred texts describing him, such as the Bhagavad-gītā and Srimad Bhagavatam, learning from our gurus, our teachers, and sadhus, others on the path, about spiritual life, associating with other bhakti yogis, offering our activities to Krishna, and preparing and offering our vegetarian food to Krishna, among other practices. These are not abstract or symbolic spiritual gestures. These are the practical spiritual processes by which spiritual knowledge becomes realized by us. Srila Prabhupada consistently emphasized that Krishna consciousness is a practical science, a spiritual science. Simply understanding spiritual philosophy is not enough. We must engage in Krishna's service. When we do so, realization naturally follows. Krishna himself confirms this in the Gita, chapter 9, verse 14, where he describes the Mahatmas, the great souls, as always chanting his glories and serving him with devotion. This verse, and many others, illustrate that spiritual realization is not passive or theoretical. It is active, dynamic, and expressed through loving devotional service to Krishna, also known as Bhakti Yoga. So, in conclusion, spiritual life is not meant to remain on the level of theory. It is meant to be lived, just like the bike must be ridden to be experienced. Our spiritual knowledge must be applied to be realized. Thus, real spiritual progress follows a natural progression. Spiritual knowledge informs our activities. Our activities become purified when we offer them to the Supreme. And gradually, realization of ourself, of Krishna, and of our eternal relationship with Krishna awakens. And all of these realizations are commensurate with the spiritual practices, the sādhana, that we implement in order to purify our consciousness. Thus, Krishna has given us everything we need, not just knowledge, but a practical process in the form of Bhakti Yoga to realize ourself, him, and our relationship with him. When we take what we know and actually apply it in service to Krishna through the various practices of Bhakti Yoga, especially chanting the mahā-mantra, that is when Jñāna transforms into Vijñāna, and our spiritual life truly begins. That is when we finally step off the sidelines, the armchair of devotional service, and open the jar to actually taste the honey inside. So let's not just stand next to our bike or keep it in the shed. Let's not leave the jar of honey closed. Let's practice Bhakti Yoga and experience the lasting joy that comes from acting in alignment with our true spiritual nature. So that's all we have for today on the topic of opening the honey jar of Bhakti Yoga, of bringing our spiritual knowledge to life via our spiritual practices. Let us know if you have any questions that we might answer in a follow-up session. In the meantime, thank you for listening today, and we'll see you next time on Bhakti Fundamentals.